Good morning, afternoon, evening, and welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents, a new offering on Village TV. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization committed to peace, social justice, economic equality, and a clean environment. For the duration of the lockdown, instead of its usual 2 meetings a month, Concerned Citizens will broadcast 2 programs a month on this channel. Our programs will feature films, lectures, and debates on topics related to our mission. We hope you enjoy today's program.
Welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. My name is Suzanne Modell, and I'm chair of the Concerned Citizens Program Committee, which is responsible for planning these broadcasts. Today, our committee is pleased to present Nathan Kelly, professor of political science at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. Professor Kelly is interested in how the federal government works and in the relationship between public opinion, policymaking, and policy results. He holds a PhD from the University of North Carolina and taught at SUNY Buffalo before coming to Knoxville. He is a member of the Scholars Strategy Network, an organization that connects America's top researchers with journalists, policymakers, and civic leaders so they can use facts when making decisions. In recent years, Professor Kelly's research has focused on how politics affects income inequality and how income inequality affects politics. Despite obtaining his degree only 15 years ago, he has co-authored over 20 articles and sole-authored 2 books, The Politics of Income Inequality in the United States, and the book we will talk about today, America's Inequality Trap. Professor Kelly and I are going to engage in a dialogue which we hope will communicate the fascinating insights contained in this book. Today, October 30th, 2020, all Americans are awaiting the outcome of the 2020 election. One of the advantages of discussing Professor Kelly's book at a moment when the outcome is still unknown is that his argument is timeless. That is to say, Professor Kelly shows that income inequality has been rising for several decades, irrespective of whether Democrats or Republicans control the government. So, on that tantalizing note, welcome Nathan Kelly.
Hi, good to be here.
To begin, can you briefly explain what is America's inequality trap? And why did you choose that wording?
So if you've been paying attention very much at all for the past 10 or 15 years, economic inequality has become an increasingly popular topic for discussion. I've been studying this topic for over 15 years now. And honestly, when I started studying this subject, it was a topic that wasn't getting a whole lot of attention in the broader media, or that a lot of members of the public weren't really paying much attention to. But that's changed as we've seen a relentless rise in inequality over the past decade and a half. But that rise in inequality has been going on for much longer. As you mentioned, for decades, we've seen increasing inequality. And one of the things that was always fascinating to me as I looked at inequality and the path of inequality over time is how it really declined for several decades in sort of the post-World War II period. And then that downward trend reversed dramatically. But we see this sort of deep U-shaped curve with inequality where it went in one direction for a long time, and then it reversed and went in the other direction for a long time. And I was interested in exploring why that was happening. And as I dug into it, what I discovered was that there's this, in a sense, either vicious or virtuous cycle of reinforcing feedback between politics and inequality. And for the last 40 years or so, that cycle has been a vicious cycle where increasing inequality tends to reinforce itself through the political process. And I started calling this America's inequality trap because what I was finding is that politics changes in ways that makes it harder for us to escape this cycle of increasing inequality, the higher inequality becomes. And so we really are in sort of this very long-term trap, or in the book, I sometimes refer to it also as a black hole, in which as inequality rises more, it reinforces itself in ways that generate further increases in inequality in the future. And so that's really how I kind of settled on the title of the book. It was something that I discovered as I was going along through my analysis of the data.
Well, before we get into the reinforcing cycle, you just stated that, and you show beautifully in the book with a graph, this U-shaped graph, that up until 1974, for about 30 years before that, income inequality was declining. And then it turned around. Now, setting aside what might reinforce, could you tell us what was going on in the mid-70s that actually brought not only a halt to increasing equality, but a complete turnaround and inequality that has been increasing ever since?
Yeah, you know, a lot of scholars like myself have been interested in that question, and actually, that was one of the primary questions of my first book, about sort of explaining economic inequality as an outcome, explain why it's gone down and gone up over time. But there are obviously a multitude of factors that have contributed to that. And in the mid 1970s, what we saw was, in a sense, not a complete reversal, but we saw sort of a flatlining. So we started to see, instead of a declining inequality, we saw inequality kind of bottom out, and it stopped decreasing, but it wasn't yet strongly increasing. We were kind of in this middle period for at least a few years. But in the early 1980s, we started to see dramatic increases where that line really started to reverse itself from going downward to now going upward. And there were a host of things that happened during that era that probably contributed to that shift in inequality. Some of those things were economic factors, basic macroeconomic factors that were pushing the economy in a more unequal direction. As we became more globalized, as deindustrialization was occurring, those were factors that were sort of non-political factors that were certainly pushing us in the direction of greater inequality. But there were also political decisions that played a role in that. And so one of the things that I think we think of first when we talk about rising inequality since the 1980s is tax policy. And the fact that we have seen steady reductions in effective top income tax rates over this period has certainly played a role in increasing the gap between the rich and the poor. We also saw massive changes in the way the financial sector was regulated, opening up possibilities for banks to do things that they couldn't do before, which also contributed to rising income concentration. But probably one of the single most important factors has been the decline of labor unions. You know, as many of your viewers are certainly very well aware, labor unions provide a sort of counterbalance in the market to provide bargaining power for workers with their employers. And as labor unions have decreased in power and decreased in prominence in the economy, that has really put workers at a disadvantage in their negotiations with their employers, and that quite naturally leads to an increasing income gap. So those are some of the things that started to happen in the mid 70s and into the 1980s, both on the economic front and the policy front, that contributed to that reversal.
Right, thank you. Well, I guess there weren't a lot of surprises there, but okay, so moving along, we are going to talk about various aspects of the political process that reinforce inequality. But in your book, to test your ideas, you use as a measure of income inequality. So our viewers will understand kind of what you mean when you say this or that, increased income inequality. You use the share of income going to the top 1% of the 1%. Could you just tell us a little bit about what that means?
Right. So, I mean, substantively, what I'm trying to tap into there is the very richest of the richest. How much income relative to everybody else do the very richest Americans have? And from a more sort of mechanistic standpoint, what you can think of is you can think of if you line up 1,000 Americans in order from poorest to richest, the share of income that the top 1% has is the share of income that one person out of that 1,000-person lineup has. And of course, if income were completely equal, each of those people would have 1/1,000th of the overall income. But in reality, in the United States, that 1/1,000th of the economy is actually that person has 5% of income. That is really an incredible amount of inequality historically and compared to other countries. So we're talking about a really fantastic amount of inequality in the United States these days.
Right, and that's you're looking at the peak, but actually, if you looked even, you know, at the top 20% or the top 10%, that compared to previous decades, the proportion of all income that they receive has been growing exponentially.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing that's really interesting about the measurement of inequality is that no matter how you measure it, yes, inequality has been increasing. Like there are lots of different ways that scholars like myself measure inequality. But one thing that we do note is the more that you focus on the very top, the more inequality you detect. And so the inequality in the United States has really been driven a lot by what's going on at the very, very tip top of the income distribution. And that's an important thing to note.
Right, and we hear a little bit about that too. For example, we know how much Amazon and some of the tech companies are gaining as a consequence of the lockdown. But despite the fact that I'm quite sure that most of our viewers are fairly familiar with this, before we get into the nuts and bolts of the politics, I wonder if you could tell us, because you are very familiar with opinion polls, to what extent are Americans really aware of the income inequality and its increase? Or perhaps a better way to put it is, because most of our viewers are aware, but which segments and what proportion of Americans are really sensitive to this? And to what extent is this kind of insider knowledge that the average person isn't really aware of?
Yeah, that's an interesting question that actually sort of has a lot of smaller questions packed into it. And I think that, you know, one of the things I think to note when thinking about what people know about inequality is there's sort of a difference in terms of what they're able to notice as things change over time, as opposed to noticing or sort of accurately assessing how much inequality exists in the world that's around them right now. So one of the things that we can learn from survey research is that generally, people drastically underestimate the amount of economic inequality that exists in the United States. They do not have a way of grappling with truly how much richer the people at the very top of the income distribution in the United States are than everyone else. So people understand that there's quite a bit of inequality, but even though they understand there's quite a bit of inequality, they do not grasp really how much there is. But if you look at their understanding of how inequality has changed over time, there's some increasing degree of accuracy in their understanding there. So if you ask people to compare inequality today to, say, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago, they clearly understand that that inequality has increased, and it has increased a lot. They tend to underestimate how much inequality there was 40 years ago, and they underestimate how much inequality there is now, but they really do understand that inequality has increased a lot over time. So there's kind of a sense in which they understand part of the story, but they don't understand all of the story. And you know, in terms of people's understanding of inequality and sort of who is more accurate in their assessments about inequality, in part, there's a partisan divide on it, and part of it is rooted in motivated reasoning. Progressives and Democrats who are sort of more predisposed to be concerned about inequality and be supportive of policies that would reduce inequality tend to have more accurate estimates of inequality, in part because they simply inflate what they think is there. So what they might really estimate, they over-report inequality, in part because it's in line with their partisan predispositions, and Republicans will do the opposite and under-report what they think is going on with inequality. There, like most things, there's an education gradient. People who have higher levels of education, well, it's actually people who have sort of lower levels of education and higher levels of education that tend to get estimates of current inequality a little bit closer to reality. And then folks in the middle are, in terms of their education and information levels, are actually the least likely to be accurate in their assessments. You know, I don't think there's like a super clear, okay, this is the answer to this question, but you know, there's a sense in which people are aware of changes in inequality, and that does inform their opinions to some extent.
Great. Okay. So your book investigates several causes of inequality. I would like to focus on three: public opinion, elections, and policy stagnation. Let's begin with the first. You use public opinion polls to analyze some very interesting ideas. Among the more fruitful indicators you consider, you look at a scale of support for redistribution. That means taking money from the better off and giving it to the less well off. Could you tell us a little bit about this scale of support for redistribution and what it shows about the relationship between income inequality and public opinion?
Yeah, so when I'm looking at that specific measure of support for redistribution, it's an item that's been asked several times in national surveys over the years, and it's sort of become one of the standard measures that scholars use to tap into attitudes toward redistribution specifically. And what that question asks people to do is to place themselves on a scale where different points on the scale reflect different opinions about what government should do regarding inequality. And the way I've coded it in the book, it's basically a scale that ranges from 1 to 7, where 1 means that a person thinks that government should stay out of matters of inequality, and it actually defines that end of the scale as government not concerning itself with inequality, whereas the other end of the scale is defined as government should take action to reduce the gap between the rich and the poor. And so the more supportive a person is of that statement, government should do more to reduce the gap between the rich and the poor, the more support that item registers for redistribution. What I've found is that what I was interested in is it was really the relationship between national levels of economic inequality and people's preferences for redistribution. And what I found overall is that there's not a very strong relationship between the reality of inequality and people's preferences about redistribution. If you just look at the nation as a whole, there's very little response to rising inequality on that item that taps into support for redistribution. But interestingly, I also found that there's a subset of the public that actually responds in a somewhat unexpected way to rising inequality, and actually that as inequality rises, they become less supportive of redistribution. And specifically, the segment of the population that's most likely to respond in a sort of conservative direction as inequality rises are those who are the poorest in America. So you might expect that as inequality rises, that there would be this sort of increasing support for government doing something about that rising inequality. And I don't find that at all. And in fact, I find that among the poorest Americans, they actually have their support for redistribution eroded as economic inequality rises. So that was a pretty interesting and surprising for most folks finding in the book.
But then you looked further, yes? Can you tell us what was driving that as you analyzed further who these people were and what their characteristics might be?
Yeah, and I suppose we'll probably come back to this over and over a bit through the conversation, because it's, I think, pretty interesting. And what I found is that racial attitudes was driving a lot of this. So what's really important in understanding people's support for redistribution and other more specific redistributive policies, as well as economic policy generally, is that there's this sort of interactive effect that occurs between rising inequality and essentially racism, in which those who have more, for shorthand, I'll call them racist attitudes. They're, as an academic, we would probably refer to it more as racial inegalitarianism or something like that. But for shorthand, we can say racism, where racism and economic inequality come together. Support for redistribution is fairly dramatically reduced. And so, I think we can see this pattern in recent election results, and we'll I know talk about elections more in a few minutes. But we see this in patterns of public opinion where folks who are in more rural areas, maybe not very high on the economic scale whatsoever, but also pretty subject to racist appeals. Those are some of the folks that are most likely to not be supportive of redistribution, to be very conservative in their economic policy attitudes, and seemingly acting outside of their self-interest in a way. And I think a lot of observers have a hard time understanding that, but it's really race and economic conditions coming together in a way that really erodes support for the very policies that would be needed to combat rising inequality in the U.S.
Right. Well, in addition to this kind of redistribution scale, you disaggregate, you looked at some other more specific measures, and perhaps the answer is the same, but I just want to use perhaps also for our viewers a nice example. You did some analysis on support for the rise in the minimum wage. Now, you would consider the minimum wage particularly to be a policy that would be targeted at the less affluent portion of the society. So is this one of the responses that you found from this population that you're discussing?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in a few different issue areas, as well as very sort of aggregated attitudes, we saw these similar sorts of patterns where people at the bottom responded to rising inequality by becoming less supportive for redistribution. One thing that I do want to note, though, that I think is important to note at this point in the conversation, because I think it's quite easy for folks to become a little confused by the results at this point, and they may think, oh, wait a minute, are you telling me that that poor people are not supportive of redistribution, and that they're less supportive of redistribution than really wealthy people are? And that's not actually the takeaway message. If we just compare the preferences for redistribution among the rich and the poor, it tends to be the case that rich people are less supportive of redistribution than poor people. But what happens is that as inequality rises, the rich and the poor become more similar to each other. That gap in preferences, where the rich are not supportive of redistribution and the poor are, starts to narrow quite a bit as inequality becomes higher.
Right, and that's why essentially it becomes reinforcing. That is to say, the more inequality, the larger the support erodes for redistribution as these other sentiments are somehow triggered. Okay, well, I think I do have some more questions about that, but I think maybe we need to move ahead because time is a factor. So let's move to elections, which of course is the next step. So you have people have their opinions, and then they translate that into voting behavior. So you have this chapter on elections that I found very intriguing. You find that as inequality rises, Democrats start losing elections. They lose most in the House, next most in the Senate, and least, but still somewhat, in the presidency. You examine several possible explanations: turnout decline, decline in trust in government, Gerrymandering. What do you conclude?
Yeah, so I mean, just cutting to the chase to try to save time. None of those explanations were really the ones that seemed to carry the day. Of those three, gerrymandering seemed to play some role. The other two, I couldn't really detect a role at all for those other two.
Gerrymandering can't be a factor in terms of the Senate, for example.
In the Senate, gerrymandering is not a factor, but what is a factor is geographic segregation and geographic sorting. So what I mean by that is the sort of well-known phenomenon in the contemporary United States where we have partisan sorting by geography, where we have much more progressive people living in urban areas, more conservative people living in rural areas. We end up having a situation in which at the House level, the Senate level, and in the Electoral College, essentially Democratic voters are inefficiently distributed. So House members that win, who are Democrats, win by a bigger margin than Republican members do. And every single one of those extra votes, over 50% for a Democratic candidate, is essentially an inefficient allocation of political support for those candidates. And we've got a situation where there's a sort of baked-in advantage for Republicans in all three of those institutions, given the way they're elected. And so there's some extent to which Republicans just have an advantage given the current political geography. But that Republican advantage has been shifting even more as inequality has risen. And whether we look at inequality rising over time or whether we look at geographic variations in inequality across congressional districts or states, we see this same pattern where there's a positive correlation between the amount of inequality that's present and how much support Republican candidates are getting. Of course, it's not a perfect correlation. There are situations in which Democrats can still win, even given this advantage. And we may be seeing this now in the current election that's coming up in just a few days from our interview. When people watch this, they can look back and see what happened. But the bottom line is that in general, Democrats face a stronger headwind as economic inequality is higher.
Well, right, and is not one of the mechanisms that operates through this increasing racism. In other words, I mean, even geography may have changed some, but holding geography essentially the same, inequality is driving some kind of a change in people's views. And these views are then translated into the vote.
Yeah, that's right. And that's, in that chapter of the book that's about elections is where this story about the combined effect of racism and economic inequality is just really, really powerful because we see that voters who have more racist attitudes, they strongly shift toward Republicans when inequality increases. But that relationship's actually reversed among people who have more egalitarian racial attitudes. The people who are the least racist, who are most racial egalitarian, for those folks, when they're in districts or at a point in time when inequality is higher, they actually increase their support for Democrats. It turns out that in the aggregate, there's more people who have the less racial egalitarian attitudes. And so we see that shift over time. But we see that race and economic conditions really come together in a powerful way to contribute to this electoral mechanism of the inequality trap in which Republicans do better as inequality increases and racism is present.
Okay, before we move off of racism, I'm going to throw an additional unanticipated question at you, which is, how are you measuring racism? What sorts of responses are you using to decide that people are more or less racist?
Yeah, so there are very sophisticated ways of sort of measuring racial threat, perceptions of race, racial anxiety, all kinds of sophisticated measures.
Actually, I meant more is not so much the precise wording. Is it primarily a black-white thing, or are there also issues about immigrants or the undocumented or Muslims?
In this case, it's purely a black-white thing, and part of the reason for that is that I was trying to come up with a measure that would be as consistent as possible over time. And so in the older surveys, you know, Latinx immigration was not as much of a thing. And so there weren't survey questions about those kinds of things back in the earlier time period. And I wanted to use consistent measures over the full time. So it's a black-white thing.
Okay, well, maybe I should retreat a little and say that my suspicion is that these things are related. So people who are very strongly against undocumented immigration and so forth, these are perhaps the same people. So perhaps that was not necessary to ask. Still, I'm going to, here's another question. I imagine that often there are people who are watching and they're wondering about other factors. And one of the things I thought people might wonder about is to what extent social conservatism rather than economic conservatism moves people to the right. Because after all, the Democrats have moved substantially over time leftward on what some people might call family values. They first supported abortion, and then they started supporting gay rights, eventually to the point of supporting gay marriage, and more recently now they're supporting transgendered rights. So how would you weight, if at all, the relative contributions of racism and these conservative family values to increasing support for right-wing candidates?
Well, you know, I think to some extent that there's some correlation there. So I think that to the extent that some of these social conservatism values are present, it's probably also easier to activate racial threat dynamics for those folks too. So I think there's probably a fairly strong overlap between the sort of social conservatism dimension and the racial and egalitarian dimension. But that said, I mean, one of the things that I tried to do is sort of insert a statistical control in my models for general conservative attitudes or ideology. And so I tried to utilize, you know, the statistical toolbox that we have to do the best that I could to eliminate that as a potential confounder. But it's, you know, it's clear that, you know, what I did doesn't necessarily completely take care of that. But I also do think that there's not maybe as much daylight as we would hope there is between family values and racial inegalitarianism.
I'm afraid I agree with that. I think also there's some very interesting historical research that shows a connection between segregation, particularly in the South, and the establishment of private schools and so forth to avoid public school segregation of children, and that somehow some of that energy was then channeled into the anti-abortion movement, because initially, actually, even Southern Baptists supported abortion. So there probably is, that's very intriguing, a correlation between people who feel very conservative about sexual matters and who are not very supportive of interracial relaxations, let's put it that way, in civil rights. Okay, let's move to your third point, which has to do with policy stagnation, or you might call it policy inertia. And I would like to start this part of the discussion by sharing with our viewers some quotes from the book. It's really a beautifully written book. The 2008 election marked a hopeful moment for progressives. In the wake of the country's largest economic crisis since the Great Depression, Democrats were able to secure unified control of national policymaking institutions for the first time since the early 1990s. Unified control of government would surely produce a wave of egalitarian policymaking. And then you talk a little bit about how this was a rather short window of unified government. 2 years later, the Republicans recaptured the House. And you also talk about the fact that even after his election, Obama had to make considerable compromises even before the House was lost. So then you go on and say, progressives in 2008 were rightfully hopeful, but they were downplaying one of the first lessons students learn about the United States Constitution in civics class, that there are substantial safeguards to prevent the tyranny of the majority. Now, I never learned that in my civics class, which I took around 1958. I did take one. I'm not sure everyone does anymore, but I learned that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were the greatest documents ever written, that every American citizen had the right and the duty to vote, and that American policy was the reflection of the will of the majority. That was clearly wrong. Your summary is far more accurate. Please explain how the structure of our government impedes the will of the majority.
Yeah, so it maybe would have been more accurate to say it's the second thing that people learn in civics class, but they don't learn it in exactly the way that I described it, right? Like I described it in a sort of more straightforward way. What I think actually learn is that we learned that the Constitution is just fantastic. And it's to be revered and loved. And the founding fathers, basically, if they did it, then it must be right. And one of the things that they did is the very basic separation of powers system was created, right? And we venerate the separation of powers. And there are certainly things about a system of separation of powers that are worthy of admiration. But one of the things that separation of powers does, the fact that we have a Congress and a president, within the Congress, we have two chambers. That means that there has to be quite a lot of agreement, quite a lot of consensus before we can change paths. And, one of the good things is that you certainly can avoid excesses in some extent. I mean, because policy change is difficult and requires consensus, that means that a lot of people have to be on board before it will change. And when I say a lot of people, I clearly mean way more than the majority, because it's very difficult to move policy through a system with so many veto points. And of course, I mentioned separation of powers, but even within the Congress, of course, we have a Senate that currently operates with a de facto 60 vote requirement because of the existence of the filibuster. And so we really have not a majoritarian system, and it's really a super majoritarian system. But one way to think about it is that it's not even quite that. It's that our super majoritarian system, and we'll talk about this more, I'm sure, because it's sort of core to the analysis in the chapter that we're talking about. But the super majoritarian system, by virtue of the fact that it makes policy hard to make, it actually turns it into a minoritarian system, but it's not a system that protects weak or marginalized minorities. It protects powerful minorities. It protects those who are already at the top of the heap by preventing their power from being challenged through majoritarian means. So it's really it's really a system that does protect the minority, but it really protects the minority at the top, rather than preventing encroachments against weak minorities, which is how I think we sort of oftentimes romanticize the design of the American policymaking institutions.
Well, could you explain then a little bit more? This is actually quite complicated, and I learned a great deal about, this I did not understand before, that essentially there's let's call it a bias to inertia. That essentially the way the rules are set up, I mean, you started to explain it, that if Obama and his people want to bring a tax reform or some other progressive measure, a new measure, that the system makes it difficult to introduce change, and that's because
there are a lot of veto points in our system. So I mean, I think back to the old Schoolhouse Rock video of how a bill becomes a law, and it actually does a good job of explaining just the very basics, right? But if you want lasting legislative policy change, you have to pass a law. Some action can be taken by unilateral executive action. Obama did that. The current president has done that, no doubt. But those things are much less durable, right? We saw that some of the things that Obama did were pretty easily reversed by the next administration. lasting change through actual legislation is a much bigger challenge, because you've got to get a majority of members of Congress to approve the legislation. Then you've got to get not just a majority of senators to pass the legislation, but you have to, in reality, you have to produce 60 votes to stop debate on the legislation and get a vote. So even if you have majority support in the Senate, if you don't have 60 votes in the Senate, you can't actually get policy made. There's one exception to that in the reconciliation process, which was used to pass the Affordable Care Act, but senators can only use that mechanism one time per year in order to make that happen. And so in reality, you have to pass the House, you have to get through a supermajority in the Senate, and then you have to have a president who's willing to sign the legislation, let it become law. And then never mind the fact that it also has to be implemented. So you then also have to have executive agencies and a bureaucratic system that is effectively implementing the policies that have been passed. So it's really a Herculean effort to make lasting change in the American system. And if you're in a situation where you need change to happen to make something different occur, which is what one would need if you wanted to take action to reduce inequality, it's quite a slog to make that happen.
Right. Okay. And before we move off of this topic, just one other issue that I think you brilliantly describe in the book is a little bit about polarization. So not only is it hard under normal circumstances, but as the kind of ideological consensus, to the extent there is one, between each party separates further and further, you argue that then what it would ordinarily become difficult becomes nearly impossible.
Yeah, that's right. I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think partisan polarization is probably the key defining characteristic of the American system right now. And by partisan polarization, we just mean that the ideological distance between Republicans and Democrats is very far, and that Republicans and Democrats are quite unified around their ideological positions. What that means is that compromise is very difficult to do, and importantly, that polarization has been asymmetric. That is, Republicans have moved very far to the right and have become very unwilling to compromise. And the problem is essentially that we have a mismatch between our institutions and our political environment. Our institutions were built around a situation in which consensus could be negotiated. And we now have a political reality in which consensus cannot be negotiated. So we have a consensus-based system in a context of extreme partisan disagreement, which does in fact make real policy change even more challenging than it would be under ideal circumstances.
So, given these insights, if the Democrats win all three levels of government next week, what do you think they could do in terms of reducing income inequality? What are the options open to them? Mr. Biden does talk a great deal about, reaching across the aisle and so forth. What's your sense as to what he could do?
Honestly, my sense is that to really make lasting change to attack economic inequality, some institutions need to change first. I think that there's a tendency to either focus on institutional change or to focus on policy change. I think that one of the clear messages of my book is that to combat inequality, you have to focus on both institutional change and policy change. And in a sense, for progressives to have a chance at enacting policies that would really have lasting consequences for economic inequality, they're going to have to do a lot of work on the policy front, for sure. It's an endeavor that's not going to be a 2-year endeavor. It's probably not a 4-year endeavor. It means that they're going to have the political power and the political will to put that effort in over a long period of time. For them to have the political power over an extended period of time, the institutions are going to have to change. So you can't have a Senate that is so heavily stacked toward Republicans. I mean, we know that with the filibuster in place, senators representing something like 25 or 30% of Americans can prevent policy change from happening. That's pretty stunning. And so in order to be able to move toward policies that would attack inequality, the filibuster has to go. And I know that there are many, even many progressives are a little bit hesitant about that because they worry about what might happen when they're not in charge anymore. But the evidence in my book and in some other articles is really pretty clear that that the filibuster gets in the way of progressive policy change much more often than it gets in the way of conservative policy change. And so getting rid of the filibuster would be one of the first things on my list to do. I would also—
Why is that? Why, before you move, please tell us. So why would it be the case that the Republicans invoke it more?
Well, in part, it's due to the current distribution of power. So right now, it is the case that Republicans have a apportionment advantage, a malapportionment advantage in the Senate, and so the 40 senators that it requires to keep, or 41 senators that it requires to keep a filibuster going, can all be Republican senators from fairly small states, and so there's this built-in. It's really hard to imagine how Democrats could conceivably achieve a 60-vote majority in the Senate, simply because of the way preferences and votes are distributed across states, and because Republicans tend to represent the smaller states. And so for change to happen, for democratic progressive change to happen, they're really never going to get to 60 votes. And they can use the reconciliation process, but they can do that on a very limited basis. And that's not going to get them very far down this road of combating inequality. So the filibuster really has got to be eliminated. One thing they could do too to sort of change the structure of the Senate in the current context is to grant statehood to DC and Puerto Rico. I was just reading an interview that Nate Silver did, and he claimed that the Republicans would, even after DC and Puerto Rico statehood, Republicans would still have, I think, a 4-seat almost built-in automatic advantage in the Senate. And so Democrats would still, in a sense, have to win a landslide in order to take control of the Senate. And, you know, they're going to do that occasionally, but they need to create a situation in which they don't have to win by so much in order to be in power. And that's another change that would help that happen. You know, another institution that I don't talk about in the book very much at all, but has become very relevant recently, has been the Supreme Court, right? I mean, the Supreme Court, in a sense, provides an opportunity for a regime to sort of extend its power over a much longer period of time due to lifetime appointments. And so action on that front would also be friendly to the progressive desire to reduce inequality. So I would honestly make those institutional changes first, because it gives you a better chance to maintain the power you need over an extended period of time, which is what would really be required to go down the long path of doing the things that they would need to do to combat inequality. There are obviously some low-hanging fruit policy changes that could be made. Rolling back the latest tax cuts would be one way to shift the distribution of income, but more fundamental changes need to happen in the economy than just tinkering with the tax structure in order to truly produce, you know, fundamentally more egalitarian outcomes. And that's a project that would be a lengthy one from a policy standpoint.
What about gerrymandering? Now, I know you did say that, you know, that's not a major factor, but it is a factor. Do you see that as, I'm thinking about it particularly in the context of the current census. As probably most of our viewers know, there have been some real worrisome irregularities in terms of the current census, in which minorities and the undocumented and whatever are going to be perhaps more undercounted than they have ever been before. So should Democrats not be concerned and not be more involved in how the redistribution is going to be done when the census results come out?
Clearly, the counting that's in the census is really, really important, and making sure that everyone's counted and that the apportionment of of representation is as accurate as it can be is truly essential for any small d democracy oriented project. I'm not as concerned. The evidence that I have is not very clear that gerrymandering is a major reason that we have the inequality trap. That said, there are numerous other arguments from a normative perspective that can be made regarding gerrymandering. It's still a worthwhile project, but if I were going to tick off the institutional changes that are required to get out of the inequality trap, I wouldn't put that one at the top of the list, even though I think it's a great project to do.
Okay. All right, great. Well, I think you've laid out a huge agenda for us. I think we both agree that the probability that we are actually going to work our way out of this trap anytime soon is not enormous. Before concluding this fascinating discussion, a final question comes to mind. While income inequality is higher in the United States than in any other industrialized country, income inequality is rising in most advanced democracies. Canada, England, France, all have seen substantial increases in the percent of total income going to the very rich. So factors other than America's legacy of racism or the flaws of the American political system must be responsible. In conclusion, could you share with us what you feel are some of these other factors?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, probably the single largest factor is that at least in these rich democracies that we tend to look to as reasonable comparisons with the United States, there has generally been a fair amount of deindustrialization that has occurred. There's certainly been a lot of globalization. So the way the global economy works is clearly quite a lot different than it was in the 1960s. In every country, we've seen that returns to education have increased, so that people with higher levels of education are, really, really strongly outstripping those with lower levels of education in terms of the incomes that they make. These are factors that go across countries, and so there's not a magic bullet. It's clearly not the case that anything about America or that America's inequality trap is the sole explanation of all this. But what we can see is that while those global changes have affected every country in similar ways, the change in inequality that's happened since inequality started to increase in the United States is quite a bit larger in the US than it is in a lot of these other comparison countries. So the United States is still different, even though there's sort of an underlying set of factors that have affected many, many countries. The US is a particular outlier in terms of how much inequality has increased. And so the policy choices we've made and our historical legacy certainly do play some unique role, even though it's not the only thing that's going on. And one of the things I've actually thought about as I think about next steps and other things that I'm going to be doing research on is to explore the extent to which there's an inequality trap in other countries, and try to explore whether there are these same kinds of feedback mechanisms in other sorts of systems. They wouldn't necessarily be all the same, of course, because institutional structures are different in other countries, and so it would be a different set of factors. But looking at whether there's a worldwide inequality trap in some sense would be something that I'd be interested in doing moving forward.
Well, I think that would be a wonderful research project if you could get some funding for it, because I do think that one of the issues that social scientists think about a lot when they think about the United States as an outlier is its history of racism, its legacy of slavery. This really does set us apart from any of other countries. And so if you look, for example, at the far right parties in other places like France, for example, they're all in support of redistribution. There are practices that we would call socialism that they're perfectly comfortable with, and it's only immigrants that they don't like, or Muslims. So there are some ways in which our history has diverged, And I think if you did a cross-national comparison on the inequality traps, you might find out that because clearly one of the things we know is that the particular kind of racism in the United States, I would argue, is qualitatively different from anti-immigrant sentiment that you find elsewhere. So thank you so much, Professor Kelly. Concerned Citizens thanks Nathan Kelly for taking time from his busy schedule to talk with us. This was an unusually informative and timely discussion. I hope you learned as much as I did. And Concerned Citizens thanks you, our audience, for watching this broadcast. As long as the lockdown persists, Concerned Citizens Presents will continue producing programs for your in-home enjoyment. Please join us for another episode soon.